Thanks, Don, and thanks everybody at GLISA for having me. We actually have, not to contradict Don, but we actually have 11 RISAs, so I'm already doing a bad job starting off. We've lost a RISA in between there and here. I collaborated on this talk and sort of standing in for Roger Pulwardi, who runs the National Integrated Drought Information System and was a former program manager for RISA. So he sends his best and says he's sorry to make it. I would say that also most of what I'm presenting here is really a body of work, reflections from a body of work, and I think of RISA that way, that it's really a collection of work that many, many people have worked on. So we're not necessarily representing their opinions in this talk, and I can definitely say that I'm not necessarily representing the opinions of NOAA formally as an agency. I thought it would be interesting just to raise a couple of definitions just to orient us towards this topic of boundary organizations and climate adaptation, or specifically RISA and boundary organizations. The first one is definition for science policy, because I really, as Don noted, I do some work on boundary work on coastal adaptation, not just funding that work, but I also consider myself more and more a science policy practitioner. So participating in the process as well as doing research on it. And I think that has a lot of the overarching framing of science policy is actually relevant to the conversation on boundary organizations. So again, I'm participating in the process, which means along with all the RISAs, I'm actually in the maze and play a different role. This is just a little bit of humor from our friend Ryan Meyer, who works for a boundary organization in California. I also thought it would be interesting just to revisit a definition for boundary organizations. This is from a workshop report by David Gustin and several others, including Susie Moser, who's on the GLISA Advisory Committee, talking about what boundary organizations are, and importantly, throwing out a hypothesis, which I think we're going to kick around a little bit in discussion today. I think it's important to note this workshop report comes from the year 2000, and so this was actually after the RISA program was started. So RISAs were not actually originally formed under the premise of boundary organizations, and they haven't always explicitly worked on climate adaptation. Just to give you a brief sense of where I'm going, I'm going to do a quote-unquote history of some of the work from RISA, or sort of the thinking behind RISA, talk about a couple of challenges or myths, depending on how you look at it, about boundary work, and then hopefully raise for discussion and hear from all of you later today about this issue of managing versus producing knowledge. If you asked 5 different people for a history of RISA, the RISA program, you would probably get 5 different answers. So I generally stray away from giving a history, although we are actually looking into doing more of an ethnography of the RISA program, which would be a really interesting science policy story. But I do like to emphasize a few important drivers. So around 1990, the U.S. Global Change Research Act was passed, and that called for actionable science that would be useful to decision makers. And I think Christine's going to talk about that later today. There was increasing, depending on how you look at it, increasing skill in using seasonal to interannual forecasts. And so there was, as much as there was a focus in some circles on climate change, there was also a lot of research, climate science research, looking at variability on shorter timescales. And also this sort of question that often comes up with prediction and forecast science is, what are we really promising people in the way of information that they can use, and how are we communicating those risks? And that latter sentiment was actually partly coming from a program that NOAA's Office of Global Programs, which eventually became the Climate Program Office, supported, called the Human Dimensions Program. And there was also a Human Dimensions Committee at the National Academies that was looking at human dimensions and societal dimensions of climate variability and change. And so it was around all those sort of drivers of thought that the idea of RISA came together. Oops. But I think if all 5 of those people would probably tell you that if not for Mike Hall, RISA would not exist. And one of the things that he was really focusing on, and really very interested in was shorter timescales. His idea was that this was where climate information could actually be useful to people, that they can perceive and use, they could perceive climate trends on seasonal to interannual basis, and they might actually be able to use that information. So I pulled this quote from an early program document that he was writing to the program managers, some of the first program managers for RISA. And in that same document, it was interesting to note that assessments were a big theme, and the driver of the assessments from his perspective was to integrate disciplines as a process to bring people together. Another emphasis, of course, was on regions, and I think that was part and parcel related to this issue of climate on short timescales, because part of the reason we could actually say something about that was we were starting to recognize patterns like El Nino and the regular periodicity of El Nino. But there was also recognition that regions were a useful scale to be able to look at the intersection of things, to look at the intersection of different political views, how those political views affected the management of systems, whether natural systems or human systems, and systems that the scientific community examines in detail. So a little bit closer to today, this was published in 2009. It's a chapter in an integrated assessments book, and it was written by Roger Polardi and Caitlin Simpson, who still works on the program, and Claudia Nierenberg, who still also works, collaborates a lot with us on RISA. And I think what they were really trying to raise are rules of the game. So after about 15 years of having scientists engage decision makers, there was this, and attempting to have people use this information, some insights about managing the relationship between science and society were coming into perhaps clearer focus. And this is itself a synthesis chapter. Rules for gathering, managing, communicating, and evaluating information and action are essential. What they were trying to raise, in Roger's words, is that procedural equity is critical. Co-production of knowledge, which is actually a very prevalent theme, thanks to Maria Carmen and Barbara Morehouse and many other folks who have engaged decision makers, is not without conflict. It can carry appearances of advocacy and representation. The more engaged you become in co-producing knowledge, the greater that you have to pay attention to the boundary and your own views and how that's influencing excuse me, the fact-finding and the development of knowledge. And most importantly, I think you have to be able to allow disagreement between viewpoints, particularly as you start revealing consequences of various climate risks and impacts. So boundaries themselves are negotiable, and they're embedded in other social arrangements. Now we have 11 different RISAs, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that these weren't all competed as grants. In fact, many of the RISAs, a vast majority of the network of programs were developed as pilot efforts and gradually built into RISA teams. And only recently did we start competing them on this more sort of this institutional mechanism of a 5-year cooperative agreement. So it is more of a network now. It's sort of a network of networks or a community of practice. And whereas assessment was an integrating function before and still is, if you look at things like the National Climate Assessment and the sustained process, I would argue that a more nuanced or a new sort of framing for an integrating function is risk management. And I say it's more nuanced in the sense that we know that risk changes. So this is just 2 different years of the National Climatic Data Center's billion-dollar disasters maps. And it really illustrates, I think, or it somewhat illustrates the dynamic nature of risk in the sense that it causes us to remain flexible. It moves across the country, and it is perhaps sometimes short-lived in our attention. If you think about Hurricane Irene happening the year before Sandy, most people have generally moved on to remembering and thinking about Sandy as opposed to Irene, which caused billions of dollars in New England. People are susceptible to, for example, drought even as they experience intense rainfall. So as our friend Dave Cleaves, who's the climate advisor to the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, says, risk defines a region. I think that's a more dynamic and flexible perspective. Another thing we've tried to do in RISAs, beyond just using actual extreme events to capture people's focus and form relationships, when they turn to the scientific community, is think about how to institutionalize some of these integrated capabilities. So we've always been an interdisciplinary program, and we've always struggled to bring people together in an integrated fashion, so we're really trying to codify these or institutionalize these, and they're really not these 5 capabilities in the middle here: understand context, understand risk, sustain knowledge networks, innovate services, and learn through practice, are not wildly divergent from what's in the literature on evaluations of RISAs or the National Research Council's Informing Effective Decisions report, but they're at least sort of codified. And so we're trying to really help make more transparent what it is that has made RISA successful. So that's just a brief history of RISA. Now I actually want to put some of these issues or points about boundary organizations into some real-world context. And I'm throwing these out there as partly for discussion, challenges or myths at the boundary of science and decision-making. And the first one is that a lack and or a scale of knowledge, a lack of knowledge or the scale of knowledge is holding us back. People can make decisions with uncertain or imperfect information. Now, their ability to do so is improved by better quality information and risks communicated effectively. But more often than not, they seek the safety of accuracy and precision to avoid the conflict that information presents. So this reality that some of these uncertain trends challenge their fundamental behaviors is really important to RISA as we focus more and more on adaptation and resilience. So I recently found myself in the unusual position of actually negotiating against my own science or research. After Sandy, we were under the auspice of the President's Sandy Task Force. FEMA had the ability to come out and couple its information about current risk, in other words, the base flood elevations that are a part of the National Flood Insurance Program, with information about future risk, specifically sea level rise scenarios. So it was a team of folks from NOAA, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and the U.S. Global Change Research Program putting together this tool. And most folks involved with this effort thought that we could just use the global sea level rise scenarios that we developed in support of the national assessment for the whole of the Sandy affected region. In other words, we would take a bathtub approach by adding these sea level rise scenarios to various base flood elevations or advisory base flood elevations, and then map that and put it in a tool, visualization tool. However, having met with the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, our Northeast RISA, and their partners at the New York City Mayor's Office, I knew that the New York City panel on climate change scenarios, and the CC-run RISA actually supports and helps lead the New York City panel on climate change. I knew that their scenarios built into the tool would actually enable New York City to better implement the resilience plans that they had for their community development block grants. So we had to build a case to include the NPCC scenarios into the Sandy sea level rise tool. Not only the President's task force was sort of the decider on what this tool looked like and the information contained in it, but it was actually also the National Security Council. This is a big deal. For FEMA to actually be at least partly related to information on future risk is very sensitive, because the National Flood Insurance Program does not allow them to project, to integrate climate information or information on future risk. So what you see here in this snapshot of the Lower West Side and the Battery is illustrative of this problem, in the sense that what we eventually agreed on was that we would use the New York City panel on climate change sea level rise scenarios for the 5 boroughs of New York, but not other places in New York and New Jersey. And so you have these versions of the map around New York where you have Hoboken juxtaposed with the Lower West Side, and you have no sea level rise information next to New York City with the sea level rise map. So we actually had to build 2 different components of this tool, one that handled New York and New Jersey and one that handled New York City. And, you know, political leaders who like everything to be very neat and tidy were not very big fans of this. Nonetheless, we were able to actually make a use case to explain to them that there was a process in place, that those scenarios were peer-reviewed, that the New York City panel on climate change had actually engaged folks, utility directors, and other decision makers in the development of those scenarios, and there was a very rigid and very formal process by which they arrived at those scenarios. And I think it's really important to note that it wasn't just our sort of negotiation of these scenarios, it was also that New York City had tremendous political clout with the Sandy Task Force. So you can see that things at the boundary get messy. Of course, one of the saving graces, in my opinion, is that actually planning departments have a very complementary focus to boundary organizations. They're forward-looking, they're goal-focused, they have really a mandate to be fiscally responsive and policy coherent, and to engage the public around the plans that they're developing. So, in a sense, the New York City panel on climate change had negotiated the rules for their process and for those sea level rise scenarios, and the political leaders, high-level political leaders, could see that this was actually related to part of New York City's plans. And so these are some of the same points that Roger has made before about working with planning departments and the characteristics that make planning departments natural partners to boundary organizations. But of course, in the context of what GLISA is trying to do with networks, I think there's another dimension in that there are organizations like the American Planning Association and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network that have networks of partnerships in place. So there are economies of institutional scale that I think make it a very natural partnership and amplify our ability to support people with scientific information. So the second challenge or myth is that knowledge is a commodity, and if we could just establish a market value, then maybe we could get more support for a service. You notice that as part of No, I left that part off the slide. You know, with information use, the conversation often turns to the private sector and the market value of information. But if you're talking about transformative change, like increasing resilience or adaptation, knowledge, I think, should be looked at as an integral part of a democracy and not something that the scientific community owns and society waits for. So boundary organizations stress the importance of the process, they stress the importance of people, and are integral to our nation's governance. This particular example I've chosen to highlight is a story from San Francisco. I was not involved with both of these efforts, only one. But anyway, back in the early to mid-1990s, there was a general sentiment that piecemeal ecosystem restoration was not actually going to achieve the values set forth in the Coastal Management Plan for the San Francisco Bay. That just restoring an acre here or a couple hundred acres here and there would not actually result in a healthy ecosystem. So there was a public-private effort supported by the California Coastal Conservancy to negotiate the Baylands ecosystem goals. So these were environmental goals for restoration for the whole of the San Francisco Bay. And BCDC was involved, so there was some representation of the perspective of development. The organizations like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Game, a whole host of scientific and management organizations thinking about what are our goals for restoration. This wasn't a perfect process, I'm not suggesting that it was, but I think it was really critical to getting the support required to do the South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration Project. So if you're not familiar, the South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration Project is a 15,000 acre tidal wetland restoration project. It's the largest one ever endeavored on the Pacific coast of North America, at least back in 2010, that was the case. And it really is a transformation of the South Bay shoreline. It was always intended to be serve both a habitat function, but also a flood protection function for the cities and organizations that populate the South San Francisco Bay. And if you're not familiar, that includes Stanford, Google, Genentech, and many other sort of high-profile businesses and institutions. So it's really critical to establish the goals from one institution to another, no matter what scale. And that's a part of understanding risk communication as a social process. So more than one or even two-way. So we're talking about, within RISA, developing a mixed portfolio of products, research, communication, and applications credible to both scientific and operational communities. And this is just a diagram that sort of shows, puts that goal focus during times of environmental change. And this is from Roger, but just sort of trying to illustrate, hopefully, a similar point from the case study from the San Francisco Bay. So what are the implications for RISA in terms of managing versus producing knowledge? We have still a very strong focus on climate variability. And I think we always will, because that is actually important to people. People make decisions on different timescales. But we also, if you look at a sort of a cross-section of all the RISA mission statements, you will see that more people are acknowledging resilience and adaptation and reducing vulnerability. They are actually explicitly focusing somewhat on the long term, on transformational change. We're trying to support that with scientific information. Scientific information presents a conflict. And overcoming that conflict, it requires working at the boundary, which, as we've said, is itself negotiable. So what's the relative importance of doing boundary work versus producing knowledge? So I'll come back to the New York City example. Knowledge production is still really important. I think it's still the premium that you use to form partnership. It's still one of the ways that we provide value. But I will say that, you know, the sea level rise projections that the New York City Panel on Climate Change really weren't that different from what they published in 2010. The assumptions were definitely different and integrated the latest science, and New York City should be commended for embracing the latest science. But they still wanted to say that they had the latest science, but they haven't really yet widely acknowledged or recognized, or most people haven't, even if not New York City, the boundary work, some of this conflict negotiation and some of the management of the conversations that happen when you start to use science. And I think we have to give prominence to that. We have to really start to make explicit some of what we're trying to do in RISAs. You know, so I'm putting out here this sort of to further define the boundaries, at least in the context of RISA, this assumption that the mission of RISA can't be achieved through any one scientific discipline, method, or capability, but rather a new set of evolving behaviors and practices for doing science, particularly where you have iterative engagement. So it's really a new practice. It's a community of practice that supports a new practice to make things more useful. And if that's the case, if it's about practices and behaviors, then it's at least in part about people. So we have had principles that have really driven some of this work on actionable science and information and doing boundary work, credibility, salience, and legitimacy. And I think those were really, at least at the outset, geared towards the quality and characteristics of information and process. But I think what's emerging now are principles that help define the kinds of peoples and behavior and practice that we want to encourage. Continual learning, interdisciplinarity, social commitment, institutional commitment, and collaboration. And really trying to elevate these to the level of, say, you know, at least what I think about is NOAA, is very difficult. And I think we really need to, though, be explicit. If we can be more explicit about what this means for the people working in our organizations, literally what kinds of activities are associated with these principles that support these principles at that level, we would be talking about transformational change in science policy. So I look forward to conversations later today, and in the spirit of these principles, wouldn't want to put these forth as prescribed or already set in stone, but more just ideas to negotiate. So thanks.